So in this video, we're going to focus on how we can actually gather input in the Java programming language. So in order to gather input into the Java programming language, we actually need to import in what is called the scanner class into our program. So it's actually not built into our program yet. We need to actually bring in a pre-built class that we can access and use in order to have that input in our program. So what you're going to need to do at the beginning of a program, if you actually want to import in the scanner class and get user input, is you'll need to put this line of code where it says import java.util.scanner semicolon at the very top of your program. That's going to be line 1, actually ahead of your class heading that you've created. So that line of code is going to go at the very, very top. And what that will do is it will import in the scanner class, which then allows you to create code that will take input in from users. So you need to make sure you have that at the beginning of your program. Now, the second piece of this is once you bring in the scanner class, you actually have to use it in order to create a scanner object that you can actually use to gather input in your program. So in order to do that, we need to type the following line of code in right here. So what this line of code is doing is it is creating a scanner object. Now, this word in right here, we are just using the word in there as the name of the object. So you can actually change that to be something else. I tend to be very consistent and leave it as in. But what this is doing is it's creating a scanner object. And again, we're going to talk more about objects later in this course. But in order to use and gather input, we need to be able to write this line of code. So we're going to add this line of code into the very, very top of our program in order to import in the scanner class. And then we're going to create a scanner object that we can use within our program in order to actually bring in that user input and actually use it. Which is kind of cool. So what we're going to do is we're going to create a program that does the following. We're going to ask the user to enter in their first name, last name, and their age. And then we're going to print this information to the screen on 3 separate lines, 1 for each fact. So what we're going to do is we are going to go into Replit. So if you're not in Replit yet, please go there. And we're going to go into our Replits. I'm going to go to Java Unit 1. And I'm going to create a program called Java. Actually, I need to make it in Java. And then I'm going to create a program called Java Unit 1 Lesson 4 Gather Input. Now remember, as I do this, I am creating a Java folder that's going to house all of my Java class files. So here I'm going to create my Replit. And now I have my new folder. And inside of this folder is going to be that generic main function. Remember, I like to reposition my brackets so that I can see the beginning and end of them. And then we're going to delete out this print statement because we do not need it. So this class, its purpose is to call the class that we're going to create. And we're going to do a new file here. And we're going to call this gather input.java. So now you can see that we have our main class. It's going to call our gather input class. So I'm actually going to go ahead and add the line into our main class right away. Call it gather input.main. In parentheses, I have the word args and then the semicolon. So the main is going to call my gather input class to run. And now I need to program my gather input file. So here I have public class gather input. Remember all of the matching that has to take place. This has to match this identically so that we don't have any errors. We then have to put in our brackets so we have the beginning and end of our class file. We then have public, static, void, main, string, square brackets, space, args. And then again, we have our curly brackets. So we have to add all of this in just to get our program started. So make sure you're kind of getting in that mode of this is how I create the program to start. And then from there, you can create your actual program. So we're going to dive in and we're going to actually add in our code for the scanner. So this is the code that we're going to add in. I want to walk you through it before we actually type it in. We're going to import the scanner into the top. So you're going to notice before our actual class starts, we're going to import java.util.scanner so that the whole program can use it. Then from here, we're going to create our scanner. So you can see scanner in, that's the name of our scanner object, equals new scanner. And then we have 3 variables that we're creating. I'm creating a string called first name, a string called last name, and an integer called age. And those are going to hold the first name, last name, and age that the person is going to enter in. So these are just variable declarations, and we'll focus on initializing them later. So let's go ahead and add this all into our program. So here we have import java.util.scanner. And then our next line down here is scanner in equals new scanner. We have system.in with a semicolon at the end. So that's created our scanner object. So if you would like to add notes in here, this imports in the scanner class. So notice I added that comment in there. And this creates a scanner object called in to gather user input. Now I'm going to create 3 variables here to house my information. So I have string first name, string last name, and int age. And notice that I put semicolons at the end of every line, and then I used camel casing for the 2 variable names here. Now, after this, we have to talk about how we actually get the input now that we've created the scanner. So here, I want you to note that Java does not have a simple input statement like we've seen in other languages like Python. It takes a little bit more than that. So to gather input, we must do the following. The first thing we have to do is we have to display a print statement, and it's typically done without that ln. It's just done as a general print in order to prompt the user to enter in input information. So there is no line called input that's just going to bloop, pop up a message, and then all of a sudden you can just enter text in. You actually have to display a print statement, and then you have to use the scanner to gather the next set of data that is entered in. So it's a little bit tricky. So there are 4 different next options that we have, and we have to keep in mind the type of value that we're hoping the user enters in order to use the correct next. So if we use, and this will make more sense when we start coding, if we use next double, it's going to gather the next double value that is entered. If we put in next int, it's going to gather the next integer, and it's going to do that both of them until it hits a space. So it basically looks at the line that the user has entered, takes the next double. When it finds a space, it goes, okay, they're done, and it plops it into the variable name. If you want to gather a string, there are 2 ways to do that. One is to do next, and that's going to gather the first set of text that they enter until it hits a space. So if they enter in like a whole sentence, it's not going to capture the whole sentence if you use next. However, if you use next line, that will typically gather the entire next line, regardless of spaces and things like that. So this is going to make more sense as we code, but these are the 4 types of nexts that we can use to gather info. And I'm going to show you 2 different ways that we can actually do that. So the syntax for gathering input, assuming that we have a scanner called in. So notice our scanner name in is here. So if you change that name to something else, you have to be careful. You have to change this as well. This is when we gather input, we save our value into a variable. Otherwise, the data will be lost. So you'll notice that we're always going to have our scanner name and our scanner command set equal to a variable name. So we're going to initialize our variables as we gather this data. So here's an example of, okay, they've entered in a cost, so we're going to choose next double because double makes the most sense. If they enter in a phone number, we're going to choose next int. If we enter in just a first name, that's going to be the next word. And we're just going to do dot next because we don't want the whole next line. Say they enter in their whole name, but we only want the first name. So those are some examples of what this is going to look like. And again, I think it's going to make more sense when we add it into our particular program. So the other thing you have to note is that you can actually gather multiple pieces of info at once. And I'm going to show you how to do this both ways, with one at a time and then multiples at a time. So what you can do is you can actually prompt the user to enter in multiple values and say that you want them to be separated by a space. Because the way that next int, next double, and next work is they look for the next thing until it hits a space. The next thing until it hits a space. So if you're purposeful, you can actually do multiple input statements in one if you would like. You can just have the user enter something in and separate things out by spaces. Now, this will not work if you want to use next line because next line gathers everything they've typed in. So here you can see an example. It says system.out.print, please enter in 3 test scores separated by a space. So we can have this one line of code and then have 3 lines after it to gather, say they entered in, 85, 90, and 100. 85, there would then be a space. So the 85 would go in here. Then it would look for the next double, which would be 90 until it hit a space, and that would go in here. And then it would pick up the next one, which would be 100, and that would go in here. So again, I'm going to show you how we can actually do this in our program. But there are 2 ways we can do this. We can do one input statement at a time, or we can do multiples. So I want to kind of recap what I talked about on the previous slide. The first thing we can do is we can prompt the user for 1 input at a time. So we'll have 3 print statements followed by 3 input statements. Or we can prompt the user for our 3 inputs at once separated by a space. So we will have 1 print statement followed by 3 input statements. And this will only work. The only time this will not work is if someone's, first or last name has more than 1 word. So the program that we're writing, remember, is going to take in, we can scroll back to the instructions here. We're going to take in a first name, last name, and age. So those are our 3 values that we're going to take in. They'll all be separated by a space if we use the multi-line one. And when I'm saying this will only not work if someone's first and last name has more than 1 word, that's because if someone's first name is Beth Ann and they're separated by a space, if we're using next, it's not going to gather the and part of it. So we're going to assume that everyone's first name and last name has 1 single word for when we use this third option here. So what we're going to do is we're going to go into our program and we're going to actually add in some input statements. So I'm going to do these one at a time first. Let's do system.out.print and write, please enter your first name. So that print statement is going to appear to the user. Notice we're not using an ln because we don't want the new line. We don't want it to enter down to a new line. We want it to stay on that current line. Now what we're going to do is we're going to take our variable name for first name. And we're going to set that equal to in, which is the name of our scanner that we created here using our scanner codes that we imported in. So in dot, we're going to use its next function. The reason I'm choosing the next function is because the next function will gather the next string that they enter. So if I press run here, it says, please enter your first name, and I can type in Sarah. Now, I'm not printing this to the screen just yet, but you can see that it took in the data. Now, if I wanted to test this, I could do a system.out.print line down here and do first name colon and concatenate it with my first name variable. So notice here, this is just kind of a little check to see if I am doing this correctly. So I got my first name and I'm changing it to whatever they entered in. And notice here, if I type in my first name, there it goes. It prints. There it is. So now let's do our next one. Let's do our last name. So let's do system.out.print. Please enter your last name. And then I want to do, and don't forget my semicolon here, the last name is equal to in dot next. Now, in order to test it right away, I'm actually going to add the line down here, system.out.print with last name colon space plus my variable last name. So just trying to get ready to test it here to see if it works. Okay, so I have my first name I'm typing in. This line of code uses the next one, so it grabs it. And then I have my last name. And there we can see it worked. We have our first name and our last name saved in those variable names. Now, the next one that I'm going to do is system.out.print. I'm going to do please enter your age. So this one is going to gather the age. And the reason I'm going to do in.next int here instead is because I want this value, when they enter it in as a number, to stay a number. What if I wanted to do some calculations on it? Or what if I wanted to check something about that number? If I don't leave it as a number, I can't actually check that, or I can't actually use it for a number's purpose. So that's why I'm going to use next int here instead of next, because that's how I'm going to keep it an int. If I knew it was going to be a decimal number, I would use next double instead. Now, let's actually do a little test here with our code. So let's do age and then do plus our variable age down here. So let's see if this all works out. Sarah Conway and 33, and it looks like it's working. So that's the first way you can do it. You can have a print statement with your input, a print statement with your input, a print statement with your input. However, if you wanted to consolidate this down, we could do something different instead. So I'm going to delete these lines out of here. And I'm going to explain to you why this next part works. So we have please enter your first name, last name, and age, all separated by a space. So when I do this, remember next, next, and next int, those particular methods grab the next chunk of code entered until they hit a space. So here, I'm going to enter this in a little bit differently. I'm going to enter in Sarah. That's going to go into first name here until it hits a space, which I'm adding right there. And then I'm going to do Conway. Now it's going to get the next chunk until it hits a space. And then I'm going to do my 33. I'm just going to get until it hits a space. Now if I press enter, you'll notice it works in the exact same way. So I don't care which way you like best, if you want to try to do things entered in all at once, or if you want to do them in separate statements, or if you want to do a mixture depending on the purpose of your program. It's completely up to you. You just want to make sure that you are gathering input appropriately and using your next, whether you use next, next int, next double, or next line, appropriately.